Canada is well known as an exceptionally polite country, so much so that we had to pass a law stating that just because we say sorry after an accident, it can't be taken as an admission of guilt in court. Yes, that urban legend is real. It's called the Apology Act of 2009, enshrining that casually saying sorry is an expression of empathy and nothing more. However, the polite Canadian image is alive and well among Canadians, specifically because we like to contrast ourselves with Americans. There's a lot of deep-rooted anxiety among Canadians about being too American and trying to carve out a uniquely Canadian identity, presumably because Canada's actually pretty backwater, all things considered, and Canadians like to pretend that we're a lot more important on the world stage than we actually are. This has led Canadians to adopt a thing simply because it's the opposite of Americana, including the image of being overtly polite and humble versus the boisterous individuality of your stereotypical American. This has also led to a strange phenomenon where the most nationalist Canadians are left-wing, as Canada exemplifies to them the antithesis of the scary right-wing American nationalism, a topic that conservative Vancouverite J.J. McCullough covered a few years ago. However, not all Canadian leftists are Canadian nationalists. Some are your bog-standard internationalist, progressive, cosmopolitan socialist type, and others are Indigenous nationalists, who frankly resemble other racial nationalists in their rhetoric, but they're fully accepted on the left as revolutionary allies because they're part of a historically oppressed racial group. That's why, in the past few years, the polite Canadian myth has received some pushback from within, that the whole polite thing is just a successful spin campaign to whitewash Canada's colonial legacy in regards to the Indigenous tribes that existed here before white people showed up. And, to give the devil his due, Canada's relationship with her colonial period is roughly analogous to America's. The initial extermination happened not due to overt warfare, but exposure to European diseases that the natives had no immunity to, leading to a period of rapid depopulation. That's not to say that the Canadians or the Americans were completely blameless. There was also bloodshed and conflict and broken treaties and a reservation system set up specifically to disenfranchise Indigenous people. With their community lacking in both technology and manpower, there was no real hope in mounting any sort of resistance against colonial expansion. And then, after the frontier is settled and the nation is formed, these events are forgotten about. Both America and Canada, in common history, is remembered as being simultaneously empty, devoid of people, and at the same time full of friendly faces who were happily welcoming their new white overlords. Every nation has a piece of their history that they're not proud of, and this is Canada's. Thankfully, we live in an era where it's no longer considered morally acceptable to conquer other people and take their land. But this is the stuff that I remember learning about in Canadian history class in school. And from what I remember, it was taught pretty neutrally. In terms of what was in the textbook, there was no "the natives never existed" or "the natives were happy to invite Europeans in," but there was also no "we're all white oppressors who need to atone for the sins of our ancestors" either. History is history. We neither need to atone for it or to live by its standards. In that polite Canadian article, an event is referenced from 2020, where NDP leader Jagmeet Singh called a fellow member of the House of Commons a racist, and was removed from the House after refusing to apologize. It should be obvious to anybody how progressives reacted to that. He was considered a hero for speaking truth to power. But here is the actual timeline of events. The RCMP, Canada's federal-level police force, was under scrutiny for accusations of systemic racism. The House of Commons was moving to set up a committee to investigate those claims. During the session where the details of such a committee were being ironed out, Singh used his time to ask the House of Commons to recognize that there is indeed systemic racism within the RCMP, and therefore review their budget, implement additional oversight, and boost funding to mental health and addiction support. Do you see the problem here? Regardless of how you feel about those proposals, I mean. The House of Commons was discussing the formation of a committee to investigate the claim of systemic racism within the RCMP, and Singh's demand assumed that the systemic racism already existed. The Quebec separatist faction of the House declined to support Singh's motion because they believed that it would render the committee unable to impartially investigate the possibility of systemic racism within the RCMP, as the motion assumed that it existed before the committee even began its work. In response, Singh called the currently speaking MP opposing him a racist, and he refused to apologize later. His opponents simply wanted a real, impartial investigation. But if you don't automatically assume racism, you're a racist. And, of this event, that polite Canadian article says, quoting Professor Julie Rack at the University of Alberta's English and Film Studies departments, who focuses on life writing, book history, online identity construction, gender and sexual theory, cultural materialist theory, Inuit writing, mountaineering writing, and autobiographical comics. It gets to the heart of what niceness or politeness actually represents. Canadian niceness you can really equate with Canadian whiteness, and you can really equate that with Canadian Britishness. Far from being just an innate virtue, politeness has a history. Being polite is about power. It's a response to something that may not address the problem. It's not that we need to be rude, but politeness papers over or ignores the real situation. There's just too much here to go into for this video. I'll save it for the future when I inevitably do the civility politics video. What I'm getting at is, there's a view among some Canadian progressives that Canadian politeness is simply being mask on, and that Canada is founded on the same settler colonialism that America is. Alright, considering our history, I can see that point of view. But in Canada, they're taking it a step further right now. There is a prevailing view here that, right now, there's an ongoing genocide of Indigenous people. Because Canada has a definition of genocide that nobody else uses, which basically amounts to, if there is any systemic racism or oppression, it's a genocide. I hope I don't have to say this, but this is a ridiculous view. Even if there is systemic racism, that doesn't mean there's genocide. Things can be bad, they can even be really bad, without being the worst thing ever at all times. By the way, this is also why there isn't a trans genocide right now either. So that's the progressive who thinks that Canadian politeness is a mask hiding our evil racist ways. However, there is a separate group of progressives who think that Canadian politeness is not a mask, it's real. And yet, at the same time, we are also evil and racist anyway. This group believes in the whole Indigenous genocide thing too, but channels that Canadian politeness into a form of public self-flagellation over the guilt of it all. That yes, we are all guilty of not only the past, but the totally real genocide happening right now, simply by virtue of being white settler Canadians. If you want to see this point of view in action, watch any sort of Canadian official press conference, or political debate, or speech at a university. It's become trendy to apologize to the native tribe the land that the venue is on was stolen from.
Hello everyone, bienvenue. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation. I am honored to be here and would like to remind those of us who are settlers of our great responsibility towards justice, and especially in a country that is still perpetuating ongoing genocide. Today, I am here for the occasion of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersexism, and Transphobia. This week is very special to me. I am celebrating my 1 year on hormone replacement therapy and 13 months after I had my chest surgery.
There was a controversy back in 2019 where the CBC, Canada's state-funded news outlet, posted an article titled "Dear White People," where the Indigenous author was a raging racist. An investigation into the article led to this justification. It is important to note that the complainant and Miss HYUK have very different interpretations of the word racist. The complainant appears to see it through the lens of individuals' beliefs or actions, in which racism is doing something which might signify prejudice, hatred, or intolerance. Miss HYUK sees racism as a system of oppression in which one culture has been dominant while another is disadvantaged. It is historic and seeps into almost every aspect of life. Through that lens, it is understandable that she would write that racism against white people does not exist, or all white people are racist to some degree because they are born and raised in a system made by white people for white people. It also offers some insight into why her column might be acceptable when a column titled "Dear Black People" would almost certainly not be. I will not even try to bridge the divide between these two ways of defining racism. However, I must say that in Canadian society, it is unreasonable to equate the impact of a column criticizing white people versus a column criticizing Indigenous people, or any other group which has historically been marginalized. In other words, the CBC is not going to try to make anybody understand, they're just going to accept the view that all racism is systemic, and therefore all white people are oppressors because debating it is problematic. And in 2020, people shrieked their head off after a Native woman answered the door while stoned off her ass, noticed that the cops were on her porch, attacked the cops, and was shot dead in self-defense by them. The cops were accused of racism, and the entire police force was systematically racist, and Canada was a settler colonial system designed to destroy non-white people. And does any of this sound kind of familiar to you Americans? Meanwhile, that very same settler colonial system, set up to only benefit white people, has these incredible educational slides meant for government employees to view. White supremacy culture is such negative qualities as a sense of urgency, defensiveness, worship of the written word, fear of open conflict, individualism, objectivity. At the same time, there's socially acceptable covert white supremacy, like not challenging a racist joke, or claiming reverse racism, or bootstrap theory, or a belief in a post-racial society, or colorblindness, or wait. That word, colorblindness, that's spelt the American way. They didn't even get a Canadian to make this fucking thing. They just took whatever was floating around on Tumblr, didn't they? This story here was a big deal too. The police were refusing to remove Indigenous lobster traps, so non-Indigenous sailors were doing it themselves, because they were operating out of season without a license. And it turns out, once the authorities finally investigated, they discovered that these operations were actually harming the local ecosystem by overwhelmingly targeting undersized lobsters before they had a chance to grow and reproduce. The First Nation doing this sort of thing claims to have have a treaty with the feds to be able to fish as much as they want at any time. The jury is still out on that claim. But even if true, how much do you expect them to rely on worship of the written word now that it would be in their favor, despite the damage that it's causing? But by far the most publicized event of this type, at least domestically here in Canada, are the oil pipeline disputes, where companies want to build pipelines from the Pacific coast in BC across the Rocky Mountains to the oil fields in Alberta. It cuts through the traditional lands of several Indigenous peoples, and they're all up in arms about it. The government has included them on the project, hearing their concerns about environmental impacts, and they've taken extra safety precautions to try to meet the demands. Some of the concerns are not environmental in nature, but they're economic. Some groups simply wanted a piece of pie in exchange, and hey, fair enough. If there's one surefire way to raise a community out of poverty, it's access to jobs and development. But for some groups, it wasn't economic concerns or environmental ones, but rather sovereignty. In Canada, we've got the band system set up by the, awkwardly named Indian Act. The TLDR is that each First Nation is democratically represented by a band council, which is headed up by an elected chief. Sometimes the band represents a reservation and its people, sometimes several reservations, and sometimes just a group of people who don't live on an official reserve. But there are some Indigenous groups who wholly reject the band and reserve system, instead opting to follow hereditary chiefs descended from historic leaders pre-European contact. To them, the band system, despite being rooted in democracy, is just a tool of white colonialism, and their semi-tribal, semi-feudal hereditary system of government is the one with real legitimacy. This is where we get to the Shuswap people, one of the groups who claim land right in the way of pipeline construction. A splinter group of theirs, calling themselves land defenders and later more formally the Tiny House Warriors, claim to get their legitimacy from the Okanagan Shuswap Confederacy, that the elected band representatives only have jurisdiction because Canada says they do, and that their traditional matriarchal hereditary leadership still claims all of Shuswap territory, expanding far beyond the reserve system. Oh, and for all the broader left's claim to really hate blood and soil rhetoric, and to love democracy so much that it must be forced into the workplace, in the end, they're 100% okay with siding with a racial monarchy that claims a spiritual connection to the land based on their ethnicity, as long as there's feathers in the crown. And at the exact same time as protesters were getting arrested in the way of pipeline construction, truckers are getting arrested in Ottawa. Yes, that video is still coming. You don't even need me to say it. You already know that the progressives were talking out of both sides of their mouth when it came to how good or evil the cops are. All of this culminated in the historic cancelling of Canada Day in 2021, where instead of celebrating our country, we were told to be solemn and reflect on atrocities and understand our white privilege. And that if we were good people, we would wear orange in solidarity with Indigenous survivors of the residential school system. Wait a minute, that's not a historic cancelling. They've been calling for that every Canada Day since Canada's 150th birthday back in 2017. That's an event I also did a video on way back when. Orange has since become an activist color here in Canada for anything First Nations related, from the aforementioned residential school system, to missing Indigenous prostitutes, to the pipeline stuff, to the land treaties and the hunting and fishing rights, to anything else that could be considered racist or colonial. The residential school system, by the way, was a series of Catholic-run government-funded schools specifically designed for Indigenous children. Early in their history, they were noteworthy for being a component of the actual genocide that took place, where the RCMP stole children from their parents to be culturally re-educated to be Western. A lot of real physical and sexual abuse happened at these schools, and they are considered one of those legitimately dark spots in Canadian history, causing a lot of intergenerational physical abuse, PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide among Canada's Indigenous population. The final school closed in 1997. And the remaining survivors of the system received both an official apology from the government as well as financial compensation. That being said, the residential school system first kicked into gear in 1894, and the vast majority of the abuse happened earlier in the system's life rather than later. A number of reforms, most notably in 1969, changed how the residential schools operated, and by the time the final ones were closing their doors, the schools had reformed to the point they were actually decent institutions, and there was even some resistance by the Indigenous students served by them. But in the end, the historical stain was too great. Mention the phrase at residential school to a Canadian, and you'll hear more sorries than you ever thought possible, even from us. Everything came to a head when, last year, there was a widely publicized mass grave site found at one of these residential schools. I even did a video on it myself, reporting on the information available at the time. And there's a lot more information available now 1 year on. The newly publicized existence of this mass grave site brought that Canadian shame and self-flagellation back to the forefront once again. Everybody was wearing orange and talking about how awful Canada is and how white settlers should be ashamed and need to gracefully bow and step back and castrate themselves in the name of diversity. Everyone was tripping all over themselves to show how badly they felt about it. The only problem is, it's not true. It's been a year now, and not a single body has been found. A professor of history at the University of Montreal, with a French name that I can't pronounce, published this article in Kamloops. Not one body has been found. He examined all of the data publicly available from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the body meant to investigate the truth of the residential schools. where it compiled all government records, all school records, all band records, and all church records, and made them public. And he found it was all just a bunch of bullshit. Last year's news story broke because an anthropologist, Sarah Beaulieu, used a new ground-penetrating radar technology on a location suspected to be a mass gravesite, and her preliminary report did identify abnormalities in the soil that could be bodies, but also could be tree roots in the soil of an apple orchard on the old school grounds. There has, as of yet, been no exhumation of any potential bodies at the site, and Beaulieu said specifically the only way to know is to exhume them because this technology is not enough to determine what's actually down there. But despite this, and despite the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's conclusion that there was cultural genocide only and not physical genocide at these schools, the media reported on the ground-penetrating radar as if it were the smoking gun necessary to condemn all white Canadians for a crime that happened 100 years ago. Meanwhile, official records show that 49 students at the Kamloops Residential School died from 1915 to 1964. 17 of them died in a hospital, 8 of them on their own reservations as a result of illness or accidents. 4 had autopsies, 7 had coroner inquests, 24 were buried at their home reserves cemetery, and only 4 were buried at the school. This doesn't sound like a genocidal regime covering up the deaths of children and hiding them from their parents and dumping the bodies into a big hole in the ground. A big hole, keep in mind, that would have been dug on the Kamloops Reservation, as that's where the school was, right beside the school's actual cemetery. The chief of the Kamloops Reservation stated publicly that the children's remains were known about in the community to reside in the school's cemetery this whole time. In my opinion, the reason the band hasn't moved forward with further investigations is because there's probably no mass grave, and now that the spotlight has moved away from them, they're hoping to just let the topic die. Other mass grave claims are turning out to be something similar. On the Cowessess Reservation, the claim was made of a mass grave site of 750 people, but it turned out it was just a derelict cemetery, where the crosses marking the graves were made out of wood, and the community had failed to maintain it. The same thing happened to the residential school near Mission, British Columbia. The cemetery was left unattended after the school closed in 1914 and was subsequently overrun with stray cattle. The Cooper Island School was claimed to have 160 undocumented and unmarked graves by the Penelakut First Nation. And, that's it. They didn't reveal how they knew about it, they didn't provide any details or records or stories or evidence, and they stopped talking to all media after making the claim. 182 bodies were found at the Kootenay Residential School, but it too was a derelict cemetery, with a former chief saying, "There's no discovery. We knew it was there. It's a graveyard." The fact there are graves inside a graveyard shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It's almost like there's this expectation that Indigenous people would have been immortal had the white man not come along and killed them or something. A grave with a POC in it isn't automatically a white person's fault. Now, if you want to know the true origins of this mass graves hoax, that is too deep of a rabbit hole for me to go down. You can go join Lauren Southern as she digs deep into the psychosis of a white guilt-ridden native activist over on her channel. But the TLDR is that this guy is crazy and made it all up, and it went viral hard enough and was repeated through enough credible outlets that people just now take it as fact, even though there's no evidence. That's not my primary purpose in talking about this stuff. I like Canada. It's an alright place. Yeah, there's some dark spots in our history, but that's how it is for everybody. That's not unique to us. I don't want to take responsibility for something that I didn't do, or at least something that the white part of me didn't do. And if that's individualistic and therefore white supremacy, I don't care anymore. You'd have to be exceptionally stupid to consider individual responsibility a white-only trait. I don't infantilize all non-white people like that. But I think, most importantly of all, I'm just done with the imposed guilt of it. I'm not guilty of anything just because I'm white, or to some people I'm white passing. And I'm tired of pretending like I am. I'm tired of the social expectation that I apologize because of the actions of people who look like me, who did what they did before I was even born. I'm tired of the quasi-neo-fascist land-back bullshit, while at the same time they call all white people Nazis. I'm tired of people screaming settler colonialism, like the quality of life here isn't actually pretty fucking good. Despite the myriad of problems that Canada faces, don't worry, I know all about them, this is still a great place, all things considered. We're still a liberal democracy despite the threats that we face. In other words, Canada good, simple as. And I'm not gonna boycott Canada Day or wear orange, or feel bad about thinking well of my home anymore.